A billionaire laughed in first class, showcasing his stunning companion like he had already conquered the world. But when a calm woman took the seat next to them, holding a subpoena and a folder filled with photographs, his grin disappeared. By the time the plane touched down, his carefully built image had crumbled, along with everything he thought he controlled. Malcolm Crane didn't just walk through the airport, he glided. Even among the sharp suits and designer luggage at JFK's elite terminal, he stood out. Not just because of the charcoal wool coat draped over his arm or the high-end sunglasses resting on his face, but because of the way people reacted in his presence. Heads turned, whispers followed, and airline staff instantly straightened their posture. Power wasn't just an aura, it had a rhythm, and Malcolm had perfected every beat. At 54, he carried the kind of authority that came from decades of taking what he wanted and dismissing what he didn't without hesitation. He thrived in spaces like this, sterile, expensive, and curated for people who didn't ask permission. Each polished marble tile he stepped on felt like a stage beneath his Italian leather shoes. He relished the subtle nods, the quick glances of deference. This wasn't travel for him, it was performance. He tossed a casual smirk toward a man waiting in the business class line who recognized him. The man returned a respectful nod, then quickly looked away, flustered to have been caught staring. Malcolm liked that. It reminded him he still had it. Still admired, still untouchable. But it wasn't Malcolm who made everyone look twice that afternoon. It was the woman clinging to his arm. Juliana Cross, 31, possessed the kind of beauty that made people second-guess themselves. Her sleek jet-black hair was perfectly styled, tucked behind one ear to show off a sparkling earring Malcolm had gifted her just 3 weeks earlier, after she'd mistakenly deleted key legal documents and sobbed about it. Her ivory silk dress clung to her curves like it was made for her, and her heels weren't just fashionable, they were weapons of attention. The stares she drew mixed admiration with judgment, and she absorbed both with equal delight. This wasn't merely a getaway, it was a stage. And she was ready for her spotlight. She'd rehearsed every part of today in her mind, from the angle of her chin to the timing of her smile. Being next to Malcolm was more than proximity, it was status, power by association, and she wielded it like a seasoned actress hitting her mark. "First class, please," Malcolm said to the gate agent, his voice polished and confident, like a man who tipped generously and expected deference in return. "Of course, Mr. Crane, right this way," the agent replied quickly, already scanning their boarding passes with subtle reverence. He didn't dare ask if Juliana was his wife. Nobody did anymore. Inside the cabin, first class oozed quiet wealth. Soft beige leather seats with elegant wood finishes, chilled champagne resting in frosted buckets. The only sound was the low murmur of conversation. Malcolm eased into his window seat, with the casual air of someone used to the world rearranging itself to suit him. Juliana slid in next to him, already angling her phone to frame a photo of the champagne glass against the blurred view of the tarmac and ocean beyond. She uploaded it with the caption, "Flying east with my favorite man," followed by heart emojis and a secretive smirk. Malcolm didn't notice. He was too deep in a message exchange with his assistant regarding a capital venture in Singapore. Juliana pouted, then leaned closer to whisper, "Babe, can we go to that rooftop spa I showed you when we land?" He gave a distracted nod. "Sure." Her pout lingered a moment longer. The spa wasn't really the point. It was a test, one of many she laid quietly at his feet. And like always, he passed without realizing there was even a question. Just as the cabin door began to close, another passenger boarded. Late. Composed. Malcolm didn't look up. He was buried in a glowing spreadsheet on his tablet. Juliana was reapplying her lipstick. Neither of them acknowledged the woman until she came to a stop at their row. Seat 1C. She didn't ask for permission. She calmly stored her bag overhead, adjusted her slate gray blazer, and took her seat next to Juliana, with the kind of self-assured grace that came not from decoration, but from control. Her hair was deep brown, twisted neatly into a low bun. No earrings, no sparkle, just a clean, deliberate sense of professionalism that commanded quiet respect. Juliana glanced at Malcolm quickly. He gave the faintest shrug. Then the woman turned directly to Malcolm, her voice soft but razor-sharp. "Good afternoon, Mr. Crane." Malcolm looked up abruptly and froze. Diana, he muttered, blinking. Diana Lowe, she confirmed, offering her hand with the poise of someone greeting a colleague at a conference rather than confronting someone at 35,000 feet. Legal counsel for your wife. Juliana's eyes widened. Your wife? Malcolm didn't answer. His gaze had locked onto the manila envelope Diana pulled from her carry-on and placed squarely on the tray table in front of them. She didn't need to open it. The envelope alone said enough. Diana unbuttoned her blazer, straightened her skirt, and reached for the champagne the flight attendant had discreetly placed before her. She raised the glass to her lips, sipped, and smiled with cool politeness. We'll be in the air for roughly 2.5 hours, she said, settling back in her seat. You might want to get comfortable. We have some matters to discuss. Juliana looked between them, first at Diana, then Malcolm, her expression shifting from confused to visibly offended. You didn't tell me you were married. Malcolm finally spoke, his voice tight. It's complicated. It's about to become very simple, Diana replied coolly. She tapped the envelope once with a manicured finger. This is a subpoena, and unless you'd prefer I serve it somewhere with cameras and microphones, I'd suggest you read it before we reach cruising altitude. Juliana folded her arms, her tone defensive. You're a lawyer? What kind of wife sends a lawyer to handle things instead of showing up herself? Diana turned to her with a calm, sharp smile. The kind of wife who doesn't need to raise her voice to be heard. The kind who lets facts speak louder than drama. Juliana opened her mouth to respond, but the overhead speakers crackled to life. The captain's voice filled the cabin. Departure in 5 minutes. Malcolm stared at the envelope as though it were about to explode. His jaw clenched. He briefly scanned the cabin, perhaps hoping for an empty seat elsewhere, but it was full. He was trapped. He leaned in, his voice low. What exactly do you want? To protect my client, Diana said, still composed. And to ensure you don't move or destroy any further assets before full financial disclosure is complete. You have no proof, he snapped under his breath. I have enough, she replied simply, then took another sip of champagne. The rest will be delivered to your office in Tribeca while we're in the air. Juliana looked like she'd just been hit. Wait, what's going on? Are you saying he did something illegal? Diana didn't answer. She gently slid the envelope closer to Malcolm. I'd suggest reading page 3, Diana said, her voice nearly casual. It outlines the offshore transfers, and your name, Miss Cross, appears there as well, tied to a boutique banking account in the Cayman Islands. Juliana's complexion drained of color. Malcolm reached toward the envelope but hesitated. Go on, Diana said calmly. I'm not here to argue, just to observe and deliver. The engines began to hum beneath them. The aircraft slowly taxied toward the runway. Juliana's hand trembled as she reached for her water bottle. Malcolm's eyes stayed locked ahead, his face blank and unmoving. He didn't blink, not once. But his chest rose just slightly faster than before, as though his lungs were recalibrating against an invisible weight. His hand hovered midair for a fraction too long, a hesitation unbecoming of a man like him. The edges of his polished image began to fray, thread by thread, though no one would dare say it aloud. Outside the window, the late afternoon sky faded into amber, and inside that sealed cabin with no exits and no distractions, Malcolm Crane's carefully curated world started to unravel, quietly, methodically. And Diana Lowe hadn't even opened her briefcase yet. If you were in Malcolm's place and someone sat beside you with a folder like that, what would you do? Tell us in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10. Hit like if you're intrigued, and subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. Every comment helps keep these stories alive. The subtle scent of bergamot hung in the air, intentional and calming, as Marianne Crane sat across from Diana Lowe in the room that had once been her private art studio, now converted into something much more strategic. The sun poured in through massive windows, but the energy inside was anything but serene. On the wide oak table between them sat 2 open laptops, several marked-up folders, and a small marble bowl filled with binder clips that Marianne absently twisted into spirals as Diana reviewed their steps. A large canvas, once full of bold color, leaned unfinished against the wall. The past life it represented had been paused indefinitely, replaced now by legal timelines, financial printouts, and the rhythmic silence between 2 women planning retribution. Marianne was 39, though the weight of betrayal had aged her far beyond the surface. Her once soft features had sharpened, not out of spite, but from clarity. A clarity that struck the day she discovered Juliana, and hardened when she uncovered the foreign transfers, the shell companies, and the fake development contracts Malcolm had never expected her to find. It wasn't just the affair, it was how effortlessly he erased her from his narrative. Diana leaned back, tapping her pen lightly against the edge of the subpoena. Flight leaves at 1:45. I've already checked in. I'll board early, sit beside him, and serve at mid-flight. She tapped the envelope. Once we land in New York, this becomes part of the public record. Marianne nodded slowly. Her hands were locked tightly in her lap, knuckles white. You're sure this is the right move? It's poetic, Diana said without hesitation. He embarrassed you publicly, walked into that gala like she was a trophy, then vanished behind a team of lawyers. Now he gets confronted 30,000 feet above ground. No distractions, no exits. A faint smile flickered at the edge of Marianne's lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. Do you think he'll panic? Diana was quiet for a moment. She knew men like Malcolm Crane. Men who lived in corner offices and controlled empires with a handshake and a threat. But when pressed, they always pretend they're still in control. They'll joke, flirt, even try to intimidate. But when he sees what's in that folder, she said slowly, he'll sweat, especially once he realizes Juliana is named in the documents. But when he sees what's inside that envelope, he'll sweat. And when he realizes that his mistress is implicated too, that's when the mask will begin to crack. Marianne leaned in. And the photos? Diana nodded. They're in my carry-on, originals and duplicates, from the penthouse, the wire transfers, metadata's untouched, and there's a surveillance shot from that rooftop dinner in Soho. Your investigator did solid work, she added. Marianne exhaled slowly, her eyes lowered to the sunlit floorboards beneath them. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Diana looked over, not with pity, but with something closer to respect. You gave him 12 years, she said. A family name, a home, cover when no one else knew how reckless he was becoming. You've earned the right to close this chapter your way. The room fell quiet. Then Marianne stood, walked to the tall window, and stared down at the still street below, lined with dogwoods and neatly trimmed hedges. This was the life she had fought to protect. The home she'd crafted even while Malcolm traded authenticity for indulgence. She thought about the man she had married, ambitious, earnest, terrified of failure. But at some point that fear had disappeared, and in its place grew arrogance. I want him to feel small, Marianne said softly, even just for a moment. I want him to realize that his image is one headline away from collapse, and I want him to know what silence can do when it stops being afraid. Diana stood and gathered her coat. Then this is your moment. As she turned to go, Marianne reached for a small envelope on the table. What's this? Diana asked. A letter. Marianne replied. For him. I don't know if you'll get the chance, but if you do, make sure he reads it after everything else. Diana gave a slight nod. Understood. That evening, Marianne sat alone in her bedroom, surrounded by the carefully chosen details of a life that once felt secure. The wedding portraits, the vintage furniture, the hand-stitched quilt passed down from her grandmother, folded neatly at the foot of the bed. But now, everything meant something else. The photos were evidence, the furniture, assets. The quilt, just another item to pack when it was finally time to leave. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand. It was a message from Diana. Confirmed. He and the girlfriend are on the manifest. I'll meet them at the gate. Marianne stared at the screen before slowly typing, Thank you. Don't hold back. The next morning, she met with her financial advisor. They reviewed the new trust she'd established, the movement of her personal funds, and the safety nets in place for her long-term planning. Her face gave nothing away. You're going to be fine, the advisor said, scanning the forms. You played this smart. Quietly, Marianne replied. But smart. He taught me that. He just never realized I was paying attention. Afterward, she drove to her OB's office for her second trimester appointment. The nurse took her vitals, smiled warmly at the sound of the baby's heartbeat, and handed her a pamphlet on prenatal yoga. Marianne nodded politely, though her thoughts were miles away. As she reclined on the examination table and watched the flicker of the tiny heartbeat on the ultrasound monitor, Something gripped her chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sadness. It was resolve. She had stayed too long, bound by loyalty, hope, the belief that Malcolm might return to the man she once knew. But he hadn't. He drifted further into deceit. And when she discovered the messages, the ones planning future getaways with Juliana, the hidden transfers marked just in case Marianne finds out, something in her snapped. That quiet, forgiving version of herself had reached her end. Diana was the boundary she needed. The night before the flight, Marianne made herself dinner, just one plate. She poured a glass of red wine and snapped a photo of her empty dining room. The symbolism surprised her. For years, she'd set the table for two, waiting, hoping, watching the chair across from her sit empty more nights than not. But this time, it was one plate, one seat, and it felt right. She didn't cry, she didn't yell. She ate slowly, watching shadows stretch across the wall like old ghosts making their quiet exit. Across the city, Diana packed her briefcase with precision. Passport, documents, subpoena, evidence, letter. Each item intentional, every step deliberate. She checked her boarding pass again. Her seat was directly beside Malcolm's. He had no idea what was coming at 30,000 feet. And Marianne? She'd be tracking the flight from her home office, her phone on silent, her heart already turning toward the life that waited on the other side of this. She didn't need to be on that plane. Her truth would be. Juliana Cross had never seen herself as naive. She may have grown up in a cramped duplex in Phoenix, perfecting makeup in a foggy mirror. But she'd learned early that the world didn't reward patience. It rewarded visibility. Be seen, be loud, be unforgettable. That was her mantra every time she walked into a room draped on Malcolm Crane's arm. And now, seated in first class, legs crossed precisely, phone angled for the perfect glow, she felt exactly where she was meant to be. Until the woman in the blazer sat down. Juliana wasn't used to being dismissed. But Diana Lowe's poised, self-contained silence unsettled her in a way she couldn't name. The woman didn't fidget, didn't giggle at Malcolm's dry jokes. She sat with deliberate stillness, her posture straight, her bag tucked precisely beneath her seat, and that infuriating folder between them like a loaded weapon. Since the champagne was served, Diana had barely spoken. Malcolm was already tense, shifting in his seat, trying to pretend none of this was happening. Juliana, however, had no tolerance for being excluded. She opened her phone again, scrolling through her latest post. Over 100 likes in under 10 minutes. Fire emojis. A comment from a swimwear brand asking if she'd model for their summer campaign. She leaned toward Malcolm, screen tilted his way. Look, babe, they called me a rising fashion star. Isn't that adorable? Malcolm gave a brief, distracted glance. Yeah, great. She frowned. Are you okay? He didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the folder, jaw tight, one hand gripping the armrest so hard the leather creaked beneath his fingers. Diana hadn't even opened her laptop, and yet it felt like she'd already taken command of the entire cabin. Juliana cleared her throat and turned toward her, forcing a brittle smile. So, you're a lawyer? Diana nodded, eyes still fixed forward. Or his wife, right? Juliana's voice came out a bit higher than intended, uncertainty leaking through. That's wild. You just showed up on the flight? Not exactly, Diana replied. Some seats are reserved, just like reputations. Juliana blinked. Okay, what's that supposed to mean? It means, Diana said calmly, turning to face her for the first time, that sometimes the truth books its own seat, even when you didn't invite it. Malcolm shifted in his seat beside her, clearing his throat. Juliana, let's just stay calm. It's a long flight, Juliana scoffed. Calm? Are you serious? You didn't even tell me you were married? And now your wife's attorney is sitting here like we're in the middle of a live courtroom drama. Diana smiled faintly. This isn't television. No edits, no producers, just consequences. The delivery was smooth, but the impact hit like a slap. Juliana turned to Malcolm again. Is this about that Cayman account? His eyes darted quickly to Diana, then back. What do you know about that? You said it was for taxes, Juliana hissed. You told me everything was covered. You told me not to worry. I said it was private, Malcolm cut in, lowering his voice. That's not the same. Juliana's voice cracked. My name is on it. Diana reached into her briefcase and pulled out a single sheet, sliding it toward Juliana on the tray table. You should read this, she said. It shows the connection between that account and 3 shell companies, all registered under aliases you might recognize. Your name is listed under one of them, as the recipient of several large transfers labeled consulting fees. Juliana scanned the document, fingers trembling. I never consulted on anything. Exactly, Diana replied, which makes those payments fraudulent, and if this goes to court, that makes you a possible accessory. Malcolm leaned forward, voice tight and harsh. That's enough. We're not doing this here. You're not, Diana said, still calm. I'm just presenting facts, and I'm no longer required to keep them quiet. Juliana's voice dropped. Are you saying I could go to prison? That depends, Diana replied. If you knowingly participated in financial deception, yes. If you were just along for the ride, maybe not, but your cooperation matters now. Juliana looked down at the document, her voice barely a whisper. He told me he loved me, that we were building something real. Diana's eyes softened. Did he build it with your name, or did he just use it? Malcolm pressed his temples, letting out a slow breath. You're poisoning her. No, Diana said, lifting her champagne. You did that when you thought no one would notice. Juliana didn't respond. She didn't cry or shout, but something inside her shifted. Her shoulders sagged. Her whole posture seemed to fold inward. She had spent so long believing she had taken someone's place, believing she had won. But now the cracks in Malcolm's charm were undeniable, and what lay beneath wasn't pretty. Across the aisle, a flight attendant hovered, uncertain whether to intervene. Diana gave a small nod. Everything was under control, for now. Malcolm pulled out his phone, thumbing through the screen. No signal, no assistant to call, no fixer to save him. Just the whine of the engine and the inescapable truth seated beside him. Juliana finally broke the silence. I want to know everything, she said, her voice steadier than before. All of it. No more lies. Diana arched an eyebrow. Do you really? Juliana met her gaze. Yes. I don't want to be the woman smiling on social media in a dress paid for with laundered cash. Diana nodded once. Then listen carefully, because this flight is your first and only chance to come clean before the headlines get there first. Malcolm exhaled sharply and reached for the envelope. Diana leaned back, fingers laced calmly in her lap. Page 7, she said, her tone flat. That's the one that made your wife cry. Malcolm's hand froze on the cover. Juliana turned away, staring out the window. The clouds had parted, and harsh sunlight spilled through the glass, too direct, too revealing. The silence inside the cabin pressed in on them like pressure. They were tens of thousands of feet in the air, but only one person in that row had ever truly known how to soar, and she was already preparing to land. Juliana blinked against the glare, her pupils shrinking, not just from the sun, but from the shame beginning to rise in her chest. A pulse throbbed behind her temple, dull at first, then sharper. The truth wasn't just exposing Malcolm. It was about to rip open the fantasy they had built together, and she wasn't ready to see the cracks form. The plane leveled above the clouds. The seatbelt sign still glowed faintly overhead. A tray of orange juice trembled on a passing cart as flight attendants made their way through first class. The engines droned, a constant hum beneath the rising tension in seat 1A. Malcolm Crane's hand hovered above the folder like it might burn him. A bead of sweat gathered near his temple. It felt radioactive, too powerful to touch, even more dangerous to ignore. Juliana sat rigid next to him, arms tightly crossed as though bracing herself from the inside. The confident aura she carried when they boarded was long gone. Her lips, once glossy and poised, were now set in a grim line. Diana Lowe, poised and quiet, sipped her second glass of champagne without a single tremor. She didn't urge him to open it again. She didn't need to. The envelope had already claimed the spotlight with magnetic force. Malcolm finally opened it. The first page was the subpoena. Clinical, notarized, unemotional. It carried the mechanical tone of legal reckoning. He barely made it halfway through before Diana's voice sliced through the silence. Keep going. Page 3 is where it starts to get personal. He flipped to the next sheet. An itemized ledger appeared, detailing 7 transactions from one of his holding companies to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Each entry was spaced weeks apart, labeled with generic terms: consulting, brand strategy, logistics analysis. Each entry was followed by a bold red note: no services rendered. The page seemed to pulse in his hands. Malcolm's vision narrowed. the edges of the paper blurring slightly. His throat felt constricted, not from guilt, but from the knowledge that this time, he might not control the narrative. Malcolm's throat tightened. "You hacked my accounts." "No," Diana replied calmly, brushing lint from her suit. "Your assistant did. The one you dismissed after slashing her maternity leave." Juliana now leaned in, eyes scanning the page, her name underlined on the fourth sheet. "Why am I listed under a corporation?" Malcolm didn't answer. He turned another page. Photographic evidence. Juliana at a private estate in St. Bart's. Timestamped to a weekend Malcolm had claimed to be in Seattle for a tech summit. A scanned invoice showed the private jet used, chartered in the name of his wife's nonprofit. Diana leaned slightly closer. "He used the foundation's routing number," she said, voice soft but sharp. "That's not just wrong, it's criminal." Malcolm's voice dropped to a growl. "You're bluffing." Diana didn't flinch. "Want to test that in court? The foundation's board got an anonymous tip yesterday. An audit is already underway. This story will be trending by the time we land." Juliana's head snapped toward him. "Wait, are you telling me I've been flying around on money meant for, what, children's clinics?" Malcolm turned to her, voice tense. "It was temporary. An oversight." "No," Diana cut in coldly. "It was embezzlement, fraud, theft." "You can call it whatever you want," Diana said evenly. "The law doesn't care how polished your lies sound." A flight attendant stepped cautiously toward their row. "Is everything all right here?" Diana smiled, calm and composed. "Perfectly fine. Just a business discussion." The attendant hesitated, then nodded and moved on down the aisle. Juliana abruptly rose from her seat, brushing past them without a word, her heels tapping sharply against the cabin floor as she stormed toward the lavatory at the front of the plane. Malcolm rubbed his face with both hands and slumped further down in his seat. "Let's talk," he muttered. "I'm listening," Diana said simply. "You don't have to go through with this," he whispered. "We can settle this quietly. You and your client, she could walk away with more than she's even asking." "You think this is about money?" Diana asked, tilting her head slightly. "You still don't get it." "Then what is it?" he snapped. "Does she want to destroy me?" Diana turned slightly in her seat, voice calm but pointed. "She doesn't want to ruin you. She wants to be free of you. But she knows that won't happen unless the truth drowns out your version of events." "This isn't revenge," she added. "It's realignment." Malcolm looked again at the documents, then noticed the sealed envelope tucked behind them. He reached for it. Diana placed a firm hand over it. "That's for Marianne. You don't open it until after landing." His jaw tightened. "She can't dictate what I do." "She's not trying to," Diana replied. "She just wants you to know what it feels like when someone else controls the narrative." He leaned back, breathing hard through his nose, eyes shifting toward the front of the plane where Juliana had disappeared. Around them, other passengers chatted, napped, sipped drinks, completely unaware of the storm brewing 3 seats away. Malcolm envied them, their insignificance, their anonymity. Juliana returned minutes later. Her face was pale, mascara smudged, phone gripped tightly in her hand. She didn't sit. "Why is your wife following me on social media?" she asked, eyes wide. Malcolm frowned. "What?" "She liked one of my old posts, the one from Paris." Diana gave a slow, knowing nod. "She's had access to your accounts for the past 8 months. I believe she's been tracking timelines, patterns, inconsistencies. Let's just say she built this case with precision." Juliana said nothing. She slowly lowered herself into her seat and stared at her hands. Malcolm looked from Diana to Juliana, his forehead damp with sweat. "What's the point of all this?" "You built your legacy on control," Diana said. "Your image, your company, your narrative, but you made one fatal mistake." Malcolm stared at her. "And what's that?" "You underestimated silence." She leaned forward slightly. "You thought that because Marianne didn't yell, she didn't notice, that because she didn't fight back, she didn't see what was happening. But she saw everything." Diana's voice stayed even, sharp as glass. "And while you were celebrating in private jets, whispering empty promises to someone half your age, she was gathering evidence. And when she was ready, she didn't need to shout. She let the truth take its seat." The plane jolted slightly, a real bump of turbulence this time. Outside, the clouds darkened, swallowing the sunlight. The cabin dimmed. Juliana gripped the armrest. Malcolm didn't move, but his thoughts were racing, spiraling faster than the engines around them. He hadn't realized until that very moment how cold first class could feel when the controls slipped into someone else's hands. He hadn't understood how threatening silence could become until it sat beside him, impeccably dressed, completely composed, and utterly immovable. And Diana? She simply closed the folder and tucked it back into her briefcase. No more words were necessary. The descent had already begun. In the early hours of the morning, long before the sun had crested the horizon, Marianne Crane sat cross-legged on the floor of her walk-in closet. Not from despair, from precision. All around her, heels lined the shelves in neat rows like foot soldiers, handbags tucked into their dust covers, blouses arranged by fabric and hue. Her phone lay face down on the floor beside her, black screen silent. She had already blocked every number associated with Malcolm's company. Notifications were muted. Her world was finally quiet. In her lap was a weathered, leather-bound journal, the kind with thick pages meant for permanence. She wasn't writing in it anymore. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been etched into her memory. But she held it anyway. It was a reminder of who she used to be, back when she still believed her marriage had been rooted in love rather than calculation. She hadn't always been this composed. There were nights filled with tears that had no explanation. Mornings when she looked in the mirror and didn't recognize her own smile. There had been fights, then silences, then longer silences. Then came the photos, sent anonymously through burner accounts. At first, she'd deleted them. Some part of her clung to the hope they were fake, altered. Surely Malcolm wouldn't take another woman to the same vineyard where he once swore forever. But then came the emails. His writing, lazy, digitized. Can't wait to be alone with you again. She's become invisible. She didn't cry reading that line. She printed it, folded it, placed it in her journal. That was the beginning of the end. Not the lies, but the indifference. Marianne didn't confront him. That would have given him too much. Instead, she smiled through galas, dinners, and press interviews. Played the role of the perfect wife with such precision, even her closest friends didn't see the fracture. She kept up the act until the pregnancy changed everything. There was irony in it. While Malcolm flaunted a woman half her age like a prize, his wife, his real legacy, was quietly growing inside her. At first, she thought about telling him, showing him the sonogram, giving him a chance to be someone better. But each time she imagined his face, cool, smug, strategic, her stomach turned. This child didn't need to be raised beneath Malcolm Crane's shadow. This child needed a mother who could build something honest from the wreckage. So she decided. Quietly, she would leave, but not empty-handed. She met Diana at a charity art auction. They exchanged pleasantries, admired the same sculpture, walked away with more than they expected. Diana noticed the hollow behind Marianne's smile. Marianne, desperate but proud, saw in Diana the steel she had been missing in herself. 3 weeks later, they sat in a downtown conference room, combing through bank transfers, contracts, and Malcolm's public declarations. Every bank statement became ammunition. Every detail a thread to pull. Marianne learned legal terminology like it was a second language. She stopped wearing pastels, hired a private investigator, a forensic accountant, and a discreet security advisor, all through intermediaries. She built a trap so subtle Malcolm wouldn't know he was in it until it was too late. No screaming, no theatrics. Just strategy. When she finally moved out of the penthouse, Malcolm was abroad, on a business retreat in France with Juliana. She packed everything she needed into 2 black SUVs, her wardrobe, a few paintings, the nursery furniture. She left the rest behind. The wedding albums stayed on the shelf. She'd left the his and hers robes hanging on the bathroom hooks, left the wine glasses they no longer used gathering dust on the bar cart, and taped to the front of the fridge was a single yellow sticky note, the handwriting delicate, looping. One word, enough. That had been 4 months ago. Since then, Marianne had remained still, patient, watching. And now, seated in the calm of her new home, morning light pouring across a white oak table, she opened her laptop and refreshed the flight tracker again. Flight 1932, Miami to New York. In the air, on time. ETA, 1:12 p.m. Her fingers drifted from the touchpad to another browser tab, an open document from Diana's legal team. Marianne Crane versus Malcolm Crane, petition for divorce and financial disclosure. She didn't need to read it again. Every clause was committed to memory. She rose and stretched slowly before walking into the nursery. The scent of fresh paint still lingered, soft and clean. The pale green walls offered a kind of stillness she hadn't known in years. A white crib sat waiting in the corner, flanked by a small shelf holding worn childhood classics. Goodnight Moon, The Velveteen Rabbit, Where the Wild Things Are. She ran a hand along the changing table, then gently placed a small stuffed elephant in the crib, its ears lopsided, the stitching a little crooked. It had once been hers, a relic from her own childhood, kept safe by her mother. Now it was ready for the next chapter. The baby kicked. Marianne pressed a hand to her stomach and closed her eyes. Outside, the world continued to spin. Boardrooms filled. Rumors brewed. Headlines readied themselves to launch. And in a pressurized cabin above the eastern seaboard, Malcolm's life began to buckle under the weight of his own decisions. She didn't need to be there to see it happen. She had Diana. She had the truth. But even with the truth on her side, the moment wasn't without ache. A flicker of guilt threaded through her ribs. A quiet, motherly fear that this child would grow up without knowing a father's voice or presence. It wasn't regret for leaving Malcolm. It was the cost of protecting something she hadn't even held yet. There was a time she would have given anything to hear Malcolm apologize, but that time had passed. Now she didn't need an apology. She needed a future, and she was building one, breath by breath. Trying to get the plane to land early? Diana asked, her tone dry. I'll admit that would be a clever move, but unless you're having chest pains or about to deliver a baby, I doubt the captain's going to be very accommodating. Malcolm didn't respond. His eyes stayed fixed on the seat back in front of him, unblinking. His mind churned through options, none of them useful at 38,000 feet. No email could rewrite the evidence Diana had presented. No press release could spin this into harmless misdirection. And worst of all, Juliana was no longer an asset. She was unpredictable, emotional, a threat. Her name now showed up on wire transfers and shell documents. She was a liability. He leaned in toward her, keeping his voice low. We need to stay calm. Juliana's eyes cut toward him. You need to start being honest. You don't understand the full picture. Oh, I'm starting to, she interrupted, her voice not loud but sharp enough to sting. You used me. You told me this life we were building was real. Instead, I'm in a folder with red ink and bold font next to flagged transactions. Malcolm let out a slow breath, pinching the bridge of his nose. I didn't mean for it to go this far. They never do, Diana said quietly. He turned toward her, his voice flaring. You don't know anything about our relationship. I know enough, she replied. Enough to know that loyalty for you was just something you wore when it looked good. I gave Marianne everything, Malcolm snapped. No, Diana said, her tone sharpening. You gave her the illusion of everything. A townhouse, a last name, photo ops at charity dinners. But what you took was her time, her voice, her future. And the second she no longer boosted your image, you discarded her without hesitation. Malcolm opened his mouth, but stopped. Nothing he could say would sound like more than justification. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. The intercom crackled with an announcement, midpoint of the flight. Meal service would begin shortly. The attendant asked about their meal preferences. Diana declined. Juliana asked for the chicken but didn't touch it. Malcolm didn't bother. The scent of reheated food mingled uneasily with the scent of reckoning. No napkin could wipe this clean. Juliana broke the silence. So what now? Diana looked up from her tablet. Now we land. You both disembark. I hand this folder to your legal team. The subpoena becomes active, financial records go to the court, and a prepared statement from Marianne goes to the press. She'll press charges for financial misconduct and request full custody of the unborn child. Malcolm blinked. That's a bluff. There's no custody case. The baby's not even born. Diana didn't flinch. And yet the court will still assess the environment the child would be raised in. What do you think a judge will say when they learn about jet-set weekends with a girlfriend, funded through a medical nonprofit? Juliana paled. Wait, she's pregnant? Malcolm closed his eyes. He hadn't told her. He hadn't told anyone. It was easier to separate his lives, husband, executive, lover, but now they were bleeding together, bleeding out, and the damage was accelerating. She's having your baby, Juliana whispered, and you never said a word. Malcolm remained silent. The aircraft tilted gently, Turbulence tapped at the windows like distant fingers. Diana didn't move. "This moment, Mr. Crane," she said evenly, "is where men like you finally see that the walls you built weren't protecting you. They were keeping you from seeing how far you'd already fallen." Still, he didn't look at her. She reached into her bag and produced a flash drive. "This has digital copies of everything. Your lead counsel will receive it within the hour. But I thought you might want to see it yourself before the headlines do." He took it slowly, like it might explode. "And what does Marianne want?" he asked, voice low and hoarse. "If this isn't revenge, then what is it?" Diana looked toward the window, where clouds broke around the wings of the plane. "She wants peace," she said. "She wants to raise her child without courtrooms, without scandals, without your shadows trailing them through life. She wants her name back," Diana said softly, "and she wants you to be honest, for once in your life." Juliana stared silently out the window across the aisle. She didn't say a word, but a single tear traced its way down her cheek, unnoticed even by herself. Malcolm slouched deeper into his seat. Not even first class could elevate him now, and somewhere far beneath them, his empire sat in wait, quiet, trembling, on the edge of collapse. When Diana Lowe first accepted Marianne Crane's case, she hadn't expected it to get personal. She'd assumed it would be like so many others, a wealthy divorce thick with denial, hidden assets, and insincere apologies. She knew the type. Men like Malcolm Crane, who wore charm like armor and threw money at justice hoping it would blink first. But Marianne wasn't like the others. There was something in her eyes that first day. Not just sadness, not fury, but a calm strength that Diana recognized immediately. It reminded her of herself. Before the headlines, before the courtroom acclaim, before she built a life from rubble, she'd once stood beside a man who promised her everything. She backed him through allegations, legal threats, public lies, until the day he humiliated her, loudly and without hesitation. She didn't cry, didn't plead. She studied, she planned. Then she walked away and never looked back. Diana didn't become a lawyer to save people. She became a lawyer to outmaneuver predators who thought confidence could conceal corruption. So when Marianne showed her the photos, the emails, the financial records buried in layered trusts and fake companies, Diana didn't hesitate. She assembled her team. Raj, a tech investigator who spoke in code. Elizabeth, a forensic accountant with an eye for anomalies, and a retired IRS agent who preferred to be paid in bourbon and silence. Together they mapped Malcolm's empire like cartographers of misconduct, following money trails through empty properties and accounts labeled with shell names but funding real handbags. Diana's favorite? A photo from Paris. Juliana Cross, cloaked in designer fabric, standing outside a boutique allegedly backed by Malcolm's firm. Reflected in the glass door was a watch. His, easily identifiable by a custom engraving. Diana had zoomed in on it and told Marianne, "Proof isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just well lit." She spent 3 weeks building the legal grenade now resting in Malcolm's lap. But the USB she'd handed him was only the surface. Diana believed in redundancy. Identical files had already been sent to 3 firms, 2 in New York, 1 in DC. Copies were stored in a secure cloud, protected by biometric login. 2 encrypted drives sat in a locked hotel safe. Men like Malcolm Crane were slippery. She didn't gamble with the truth. Back at her firm, her assistant Casey was prepped to release the press statement at 2:15 p.m., shortly after landing. It would hit 6 media outlets, including 2 controlled by former clients who owed her favors, and 1 veteran reporter hungry for a high-profile scoop. Casey would also upload a sealed court filing to the family court docket, with just enough redacted content to detonate reputations in Malcolm's boardroom. Every piece of it was orchestrated, every second counted, and Diana had learned structure the hard way, from losing everything once before. She remembered it clearly. Standing on the courthouse steps after her own divorce, the press swarming like flies, camera flashes catching tears mid-fall and turning them into tabloid captions. That was the day she swore she'd never be on the losing side again. Now, years later, she sat upright in first class, posture poised, watching Malcolm Crane unravel beside her. He hadn't spoken in over 15 minutes, not a single word. His breath came shallow and forced. The tension in his jaw was visible. The leather under him squeaked with every shift as his fists clenched on his knees. Juliana had curled away from him slightly, staring past the clouds with glassy, vacant eyes. Ever since hearing about Marianne's pregnancy, she hadn't spoken either. There was nothing left to say. Diana broke the silence. "You still have choices," she said calmly. Malcolm turned toward her slowly. "Like what?" "Not damage control," she replied. "Honesty. You can settle with dignity, admit what you did, sign the disclosures, agree to the custody terms, or you can drag it through court, lose your public, and watch your company unravel. Either way, the truth is landing with us." He stared at her, really stared, as if seeing her for the first time. Not as an attorney, as something more. A woman who had survived betrayal and come back sharper. He resented her for that, and envied her too. "What if I made an offer?" he asked. "Something significant." Diana shook her head gently. "Marianne doesn't need your money. She needs peace." "I can't give her that." "You already did," she said. "The day you chose Juliana, the day you forged her signature on that withdrawal form, the day you emailed your CFO saying she was unstable." His expression faltered. "That email was private." "Nothing's private when it's discoverable," Diana said. Malcolm sank into his seat, and for the first time in a long time he looked small. Not in stature. He still wore the tailored suit, still had the presence, but that gravitational pull, the command he carried into every room, was gone, stripped away. Not by Diana. By Marianne. A soft ding signaled the beginning of descent. Flight attendants moved quietly down the aisle, gathering trays and instructing passengers to prepare for landing. Diana packed up her folder, secured her briefcase, and retrieved a small tube of lip balm from her coat. Across the aisle, a couple whispered about brunch. Behind her, someone ordered a scotch. The world kept moving, oblivious to the collapse unfolding in seat 1A. Malcolm stared out the window, unmoving. Juliana whispered something under her breath. He didn't answer. Diana, calm and composed, leaned toward him one final time. "When we land," she said evenly, "you won't have time to spin this. The press will be waiting. Maybe even protesters. But all of that is just noise." She paused. "Focus on one thing now. Telling the truth. For once." He said nothing. She smiled gently. "You won't be remembered for your empire, Malcolm. You'll be remembered for how you lost it." And with that, she leaned back and fastened her seatbelt as the cabin tipped forward. Below them, the city gleamed in sunlight, unaware that high above its skyline, a man who believed he owned everything was moments from learning what it meant to lose everything. Quietly. No sirens, no cameras, just a descent. And the truth waiting at the gate. Meal trays stowed, seats upright, seatbelts clicked with the autopilot efficiency of 100 passengers pretending to be present, when their minds were already halfway through emails, conference calls, and group chats waiting on the ground. But in seat 1A, Malcolm Crane felt like he was plummeting, not from altitude but from exposure. He'd faced worse on paper: regulatory scrutiny, aggressive investors, boardroom showdowns. He'd won every time, through manipulation, through charm, through sheer bravado. But this wasn't strategy. This was precision. This was personal. And there was no spin, no savior, no sleight of hand. Beside him, Juliana Cross sat rigid, her arms folded tightly across her midsection. Her face was unreadable, her eyes glassy but dry, as if she'd run out of tears somewhere over Pennsylvania. The skin beneath her eyes looked bruised with the weight of understanding. Her silence wasn't passive, it was screaming. The realization of who Malcolm really was had shattered whatever illusion she had clung to, and now only truth remained. Malcolm hadn't said a word in over 20 minutes. Not because he didn't want to, but because he had nothing left to say that wouldn't feel hollow. She had seen the files, heard Diana's calm dissection of every one of his lies. He wasn't who she thought she seduced. He wasn't even who he had pretended to be. And she was starting to see that the luxury she'd wrapped herself in wasn't wealth. It was residue, borrowed from another woman's sacrifice. Across the aisle, Diana Lowe adjusted her sleeves. Calm, exact. She scrolled through her phone now that they'd dipped below 10,000 feet and reception had returned. A ping, then another. One message stood out from Casey. Press release out, petition filed, coverage live. Diana allowed herself one small inhale. The final domino had fallen. Malcolm heard her phone buzz, turned his head. "It's public, isn't it?" "Yes," Diana replied without looking up. "Your board has the petition. Your CFO's been notified of the asset freeze. PR is scrambling." But the headlines will write themselves. He didn't answer. Words didn't matter now, but still, he tried. Marianne doesn't want to destroy me, he said hoarsely. She's not like that. No, Diana said, eyes on him now. She's not, but even the kindest women stop protecting the ones who keep hurting them. The steel behind her voice didn't waver, because she knew what it had taken for Marianne to stop shielding him. It was not vengeance. It was survival. Juliana shifted beside him. You're freezing his accounts? She asked. Only the ones tied to the marital estate, Diana replied. Anything opened after separation is under federal review. Juliana's face tightened. What about mine? Diana turned slowly. The boutique account? The one funded through misappropriated grants? Juliana's lips parted. I didn't know. That's your defense, Diana said evenly. Whether it holds depends on your honesty. Juliana blinked. I didn't ask for this. You benefited, Diana replied. That's enough for them to question you. The truth, cold and impartial, didn't care whether Juliana had signed the wire transfers herself. She had worn the privilege, and now she would carry the consequence. Malcolm winced. She's not responsible for my choices. No, Diana said, but she's part of the narrative now. And stories leave stains. The aircraft dropped again, gently. Lights flickered, then glowed bright. The final checks began, seatbacks, devices, belts. But no one in row 1 moved. Malcolm leaned forward, elbows to knees, trying to slow his breathing. It felt like drowning in silence. His hands trembled, his vision tunneled. He counted the stitching on the carpet, trying to stay tethered. Each breath was a war against the panic rising in his throat, the realization that control wasn't slipping, it had already left him. Diana noticed, but didn't intervene. He didn't deserve reprieve. He deserved the full weight of it. You could have ended this quietly, he muttered. Diana's voice was like glass. You could have. He looked up, eyes rimmed red. What's in the letter? Diana reached into her briefcase, pulled the envelope Marianne had handed her, placed it on his tray. She said to read it after everything else. I'd say this qualifies. His fingers trembled as he broke the seal and unfolded the page. Marianne's handwriting stared back at him, elegant, precise, familiar. Malcolm, I once believed you were the best thing that ever happened to me. I built my life around that belief. I defended it. I justified it even when it hurt. But somewhere along the way, I realized I was loving someone who didn't exist anymore. Or maybe never did. You stopped seeing me, you stopped hearing me, but worst of all, you stopped respecting me. So now I am choosing myself. I am choosing peace. I am choosing a life for our child that does not begin in lies and betrayal. You'll have your day in court, you'll have your chance to speak, but you no longer get to shape my story. That privilege is gone. This is not revenge. This is release. Goodbye, Malcolm. Marianne. He read it twice, then a third time. By the fourth, he couldn't stop his hands from shaking. His breath hitched in his throat, the silence between each line echoing louder than the engines outside. The letter wasn't angry, it was resolute, and somehow that made it more unbearable. The plane began its final descent. The captain's voice announced, landing in 10 minutes. The city's skyline came into view, and with it, the shadows of consequences waiting to unfold. Juliana glanced at him one last time, but there was no pity in her eyes, just distance. Malcolm folded the letter and placed it back into the envelope. He sat upright, fastened his belt, and stared ahead. And Diana, she simply opened her window shade, letting the light pour in. The storm was behind them now, but on the ground, the winds were just beginning to shift. Marianne Crane watched the small green dot inch across the digital map with quiet focus. Her laptop sat open on the kitchen counter. The flight tracking site glowing against the soft morning light spilling through the bay windows of her new home. The baby had kicked twice since breakfast, each nudge a reminder of the life she was choosing to protect. A future growing quietly beneath her ribs, unseen but commanding every choice. The kettle whistled in the background, steam curling up into the air, but she didn't move to turn it off. Her eyes remained on the screen, her breathing steady. Flight 932 was nearing its final descent into New York, 5 minutes to impact. Not a crash, not a tragedy. No one would die today. But something long overdue was finally landing. She picked up her mug and walked slowly to the dining table, the same one she had eaten alone at every night for the past 4 months. This room had become her sanctuary, her command center. The place where she had taken back control one small, painful decision at a time. Every chair had held silence. Every meal had been a quiet protest. And now it had become the ground zero of her renewal. Everything in this space was deliberate. The minimalist decor, the soft gray curtains, the framed sonogram resting near the bookshelf, a new chapter written without apologies. She had fought the urge to track the flight all morning, but gave in the moment Diana texted, boarded. He has no idea. The image made her smile. Not cruelly, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet, earned relief. Beside her was a second screen. This one opened to a draft email. Her public statement carefully reviewed by Diana's media team. It had taken her a week to write. She had started with rage, then rewritten it with clarity. The tone wasn't vengeful, but it didn't coddle either. It spoke of truth, dignity, and the strength it took to walk away when the world expected her to stay and smile. She reread the first line for the 5th time that morning. For years, I stood beside a man who wore his power like armor. Today I choose to no longer be his shield. She'd wait to send it until the plane touched down. Not a moment before. Timing was everything. Outside the world moved like it always had. Neighbors walked dogs, delivery vans pulled into driveways, children laughed at the bus stop, but her world had pivoted. And soon, so would his. No one knew that in a few minutes a story would hit the internet that would rewrite how people viewed one of the city's most respected financial figures. Malcolm Crane had always been careful to appear untouchable. Handsome, decisive, eloquent. He smiled on magazine covers. He shook hands with mayors. But behind that smile had been years of manipulation, erasure, and neglect. Marianne had known this. But she also knew something he never did. Perception isn't protection. She took a long sip of tea. Then she stood and walked over to her desk, opening a drawer and pulling out the small red leather planner she had used during her first years of marriage. She flipped through its pages. Dinner reservations, anniversaries, real estate meetings, fertility appointments. It was all there in ink that had barely faded. She stopped at one date in particular, March 16th. A little heart drawn in the corner, the day she told Malcolm they were expecting for the first time. He had smiled, kissed her forehead, and then excused himself to take a call. She'd spent the rest of that evening alone, eating Thai takeout and watching reruns. She closed the planner and returned it to the drawer. Letting go wasn't about forgetting. It was about refusing to carry what wasn't hers anymore. Her phone buzzed. A text from Diana. Touchdown. Marianne opened her inbox and hovered her finger over the send button on her email draft, but she didn't click it just yet. Instead, she opened a new tab and navigated to Crane and Archer's corporate website. Malcolm's face greeted her instantly. Confident, full color, crisp white teeth. A carefully staged image meant to instill trust. She clicked into the leadership page, scanned the list of board members, and paused on one name in particular. Christopher Hale, the firm's risk compliance director. He had been the only one to ever ask her in passing if she was happy. She copied the press statement and pasted it into a fresh email addressed to Christopher. Subject: Thought you should see this first. Then she hit send. A minute later she returned to her original email. Press journalists' contacts that Diana's firm had compiled with ruthless precision. She hit send again, then leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. The moment felt still. But beneath that stillness was a pulse, steady, certain, and unshakable. On the other side of the city, Christopher Hale's phone pinged. He was in a meeting discussing year-end projections when he glanced at his screen. At first, he thought it was a mistake. He clicked, he read, then he stood up without excusing himself and walked out of the room. Not with panic, but with purpose. The kind that follows a truth too sharp to ignore. In Manhattan, in a sleek tower of glass and steel, Malcolm's assistant, Alyssa, opened her inbox to find over 30 unread messages, all with the subject line, urgent inquiry, or statement from Marianne Crane. Within 5 minutes, the firm's communications director was summoned from lunch. The internal crisis team was activated. Phones began to ring without pause. Investors, journalists, donors, some angry, some confused, none surprised. The collapse had begun. But it was happening quietly, surgically, the way Diana had always planned. Meanwhile, Diana walked off the plane with deliberate ease. She didn't rush, she didn't speak. She simply stepped into the terminal, past the awaiting black car with tinted windows, and handed the driver her briefcase before getting in. She checked her phone, confirmation of court receipt. News alerts already populating her feed. Headlines forming: Malcolm Crane, accused of fraud, misuse of funds. Wife speaks out, no longer his shield. Power couple no more. Legal firestorm hits Crane and Archer. In the private first-class lounge, Malcolm sat with his head in his hands, a bottle of water untouched on the table beside him. Juliana stood across the room, scrolling through her phone as notification after notification rolled in. She said nothing, didn't look at him. The silence between them was thick. A silence that no apology could mend and no money could mask. He could hear the storm beginning through the chatter of travelers. A man across the lounge glanced at his phone and then at Malcolm, whispering something to his companion. It had begun. His image, his entire illusion was fracturing. Not with a bang, but with a ripple. And once a ripple starts, it never stops. Back in her home, Marianne turned off her laptop. She stood and walked to the window, cradling her belly as she watched the trees sway gently in the wind. It was just another morning to the world, but for her, it was a reckoning. And a release. No press would show up at her door. No statement would come from her lips. Her work was already done. Let the world decide what kind of man Malcolm Crane was. She had made her peace, and the city was about to make its judgment. The luxury terminal at JFK's private arrivals wing buzzed with quiet tension. Malcolm Crane stepped off the plane last, flanked by silence and shame. His suit, once a symbol of poise and presence, felt stiff and suffocating. His shoes echoed against the polished floor, each step too loud, too deliberate, as if mocking the composed gait he usually carried. He walked like a man realizing the floor beneath him was never solid. He could feel the air shift around him, not from temperature, but from attention. People looked without looking, shoulders tilted subtly, glances held for half a second too long, whispers escaping behind fingers. The story hadn't gone viral yet. Not entirely. But something in the atmosphere had changed. Those who recognized him weren't smiling. Juliana followed a few paces behind, her heels no longer clicking with confidence, but dragging slightly, like the weight of the truth had finally settled on her spine. She clutched her purse against her ribs as if it could shield her. She hadn't spoken a word since they touched the ground. The girl who once loved the spotlight was now searching for shadows. And Malcolm couldn't look at her. Not anymore. Diana Carr didn't linger. She had stepped off the plane ahead of them and was already seated in a black SUV idling at the curb. She didn't wait for a thank you. She didn't need it. She watched from behind tinted windows as Malcolm stood under the fluorescent lights, his face paler than she had ever seen it. He looked like a statue whose foundation had cracked beneath him. Still standing, but barely. And for how long, no one could say. She didn't smile. She just tapped her phone once. Another message sent. Another step forward. Inside the terminal, Malcolm's phone finally came back to life. The notifications hit all at once. Voicemails, emails, missed calls, calendar alerts. The screen lit up like a siren. He tried to read a few, but it was like trying to drink from a fire hose. Legal teams, board members, journalists. One message stood out. Flagged urgent from his PR director. Call me now. NT story confirmed. CNBC picking it up in the next hour. LA Times asking for a comment. Need a statement immediately. Also, board emergency meeting called for 5 p.m. Your presence is mandatory. He swallowed hard and shoved the phone back into his pocket. A few feet away, a woman in a beige coat and oversized sunglasses passed him slowly, pretending to check her phone. She wasn't pretending. She snapped a photo discreetly and kept walking. Within 20 minutes, that image would hit a celebrity gossip blog tagged "Billionaire Malcolm Crane looking tense at JFK. Trouble in paradise?" The story was no longer his. It belonged to the internet now. Juliana turned to him as they approached the waiting car. Are we going home? He paused. Home? The penthouse? The one Marianne had already vacated, cleared out quietly, surgically, like a ghost who left no trace but a legal earthquake. Or the brownstone in Tribeca he'd recently purchased in secret under one of his holding companies, which he had casually suggested could become their space before this all imploded. He wasn't sure where he lived anymore, and for the first time, he wasn't sure who would be waiting there. No, he said finally, not yet. He opened the car door for her. She hesitated. What happens to me? He met her eyes for a long beat. The girl who once felt like an escape now looked like a mirror, reflecting back every choice he had tried to justify. That depends, he said, on how honest you're willing to be. She got in without another word. The ride was quiet. The city moved past the windows in streaks of gray and gold, alive with noise and urgency. Malcolm's mind reeled with calculations. Which assets were still untouchable? Who on the board could be reasoned with? Would his private accounts survive a forensic audit? What had he missed? He had always thought of himself as 10 steps ahead, but this time the checkmate had come from a direction he never anticipated, quietly, efficiently, and without mercy. The driver cleared his throat through the intercom. Sir, we're approaching your building. Paparazzi out front. A few reporters too. Malcolm closed his eyes. Take us around back. The SUV turned down a narrow service alley. Security met them at the garage. A moment later, they were inside. The lobby was colder than he remembered. The doorman offered a polite nod, but didn't make eye contact. The elevator ride was excruciatingly slow. Each floor felt like a countdown. He looked at his reflection in the mirrored panel. Creased forehead, dull eyes, a jaw clenched tight enough to crack enamel. When the doors opened, he stepped out into silence. The penthouse felt foreign now. The furniture was the same, but the warmth was gone. No music, no lingering scent of perfume or flowers. Marianne's absence echoed in every room. On the marble island in the kitchen sat a single envelope, white, unsealed. He opened it. Inside was a photo. Not a tabloid shot, not evidence, a sonogram. His hand trembled as he held it. The caption scrolled on the back in Marianne's handwriting read, "You'll never meet her like this." He sat down heavily. Juliana stood in the doorway, watching him with an expression he couldn't place. Fear, perhaps, or maybe just detachment. The girl who once clung to him was slipping away, and he had no arms left to catch her. His phone buzzed again. It was his lawyer this time. "You need to get ahead of this," the voice said. "You've got 2 hours before the board votes. If you're not in the room, they'll take it as abandonment. You need to make a statement." "I can't," Malcolm said. "You don't have a choice." He hung up without replying. He turned to Juliana. "If you want to leave, now's the time." She didn't move. "I didn't know she was pregnant," she whispered. "I didn't know any of this." "I believe you," he said. And strangely, he did. She nodded slowly. "But I don't think I can stay." He didn't argue. He didn't ask her to. As she walked toward the door, he didn't follow. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, Malcolm was alone. The silence rushed in like a wave. Not soft, but deafening. Not peaceful, but accusing. And for the first time in years, no amount of money could buy the silence back. The walls were still. The city below roared. And the only sound left in the penthouse was the hum of the truth rising like static through the floor. He picked up the sonogram one more time and stared at it until his eyes burned. A child. A life untouched by all this. And he had already missed the first heartbeat. That thought stayed with him, like an echo against the high-gloss walls. The moment he should have felt wonder, he felt nothing. And now, he felt everything. This was not the bottom. This was the beginning of the fall. The boardroom smelled like cold coffee and tension, the kind of room where fortunes were made, secrets were traded, and legacies either solidified or shattered. Malcolm had sat in this very seat hundreds of times before, at the head of the gleaming mahogany table overlooking the Manhattan skyline. He had once felt invincible here. Every suit that entered bowed slightly in tone, if not in posture. Every chart they projected, every number they debated, ultimately bent to his will. But not today. Today, his name on the door wasn't power, it was liability. The room was already full when he arrived. 12 board members, each with a leather folder in front of them and expressions carved from stone. No one stood to greet him. His usual chair had been pushed slightly off-center, subtly repositioned. A silent shift of dominance. A declaration that he was no longer steering the ship. Malcolm felt it immediately. He adjusted his tie even though it didn't need adjusting and sat down without a word. A glass of water had been poured for him. No coffee, no handshake. No illusion of normalcy. Charles Whitman, head of risk compliance, was the first to speak. "Mr. Crane," he began, not bothering with pleasantries, "we're convened under emergency protocol as outlined in Article 7B of our internal governance charter. you've been made aware of the press activity and the legal filings. Yes, Malcolm nodded. I have. And you're prepared to address them? I am. Then proceed. Malcolm took a breath. He had rehearsed this moment dozens of times, in the back of the car, in the elevator, even pacing his hallway like a man preparing for a courtroom drama. But now that he sat here, words felt brittle. The weight of the room pressed into his chest, not with anger, but with consequence. The truth was not a speech, it was a reckoning. There were personal failures, he said, keeping his voice low, level. I won't deny that. My marriage ended, and unfortunately the fallout has impacted this institution in ways I never intended. No one moved. I misallocated resources. I trusted the wrong people. I was careless with the separation between personal and corporate. But I did not embezzle. I did not steal. I made bad decisions. I didn't act alone, but I take full responsibility for the culture that allowed it. A few brows raised. Some in the room began scribbling notes. The foundation's funds, Charles said slowly, were diverted to a personal offshore account. That's not a cultural issue. That's fraud. It was a temporary move, Malcolm replied. It was going to be reimbursed. Intent doesn't negate the act, another board member said. The optics are catastrophic. The documents submitted this morning show direct transfers linked to expenses that have no relation to our operations. Malcolm pressed his palms against the table. This isn't the full picture. You're reacting to headlines. We're reacting to subpoenas, Charles corrected, and internal leaks from your own executive assistant. Malcolm swallowed hard. The woman in question, Andrea, had not come in to work that day. A leave of absence had been filed hours before the press release went live. He hadn't even seen it coming. She had stood by him through scandals and shady acquisitions. But somewhere, somehow, she had decided the line had been crossed. And she wasn't alone. And that was the part that cut deepest. Not the betrayal, but the quiet coalition forming without him. The Crane name is now associated with criminal investigation, Charles continued. Our investors are calling hourly. We've already lost 2 major accounts. If we don't act, we risk full-scale collapse. A silence settled over the room again. Then the words Malcolm Crane had feared were finally spoken. We are voting on your removal. He looked up. Removed from where? Off the board, said a woman in a navy pantsuit at the end of the table. Off the board, off the very organization you founded. Completely, clean, permanently. Either you step aside voluntarily, or we put it to a shareholder vote. Either way, his time at the helm ends today. Malcolm opened his mouth, then closed it again. His once steady hands began to shake. He can stay on as a non-voting advisor, Charles added. It's purely symbolic. He will have no access to internal operations, no signature, no title. We will tell the media that this is a personal choice to maintain the stability of the company. Or, he paused, we'll go public with the whole thing and let the consequences take care of themselves. Malcolm looked around the room. People who once admired him, people who once toasted his victories, defended him at investment meetings and cocktail parties. Now they looked at him like surgeons facing necrotic tissue. Reluctant but determined to amputate. Then his phone vibrated. A message from his lawyer. Marianne's legal team has just filed an emergency support request. Custody terms are now public. Media is asking for a response. That's it. He leaned back in his chair and nodded slightly. Do what needs to be done. The vote took place. 11 votes in favor, 1 abstention, no votes against. Malcolm Crane is officially removed from the company he founded, from the board he once controlled, and from the legacy he once thought sacrosanct. It took only 17 minutes. When he left the conference room, no one followed him. The elevator seemed endless. The great hall was filled with flashing cameras. The paparazzi had found their moment. Reporters shouted questions. Mr. Crane, is it true that you transferred funds from your wife's charity to your personal account? Are you going to resign from all the councils? Have you talked to the child's mother? He did not answer. Security formed a wall around him, leading him to the black car waiting outside. But even behind the see-through glass, he felt naked, exposed. He was no longer a man. He was a headline, a cautionary tale, a coming downfall. He looked out the window as the city passed by. This is no longer a story you can bribe into control. This is the final stage, and the landing gear locked into place. He didn't blink. Malcolm Crane walked through the crowd, his face stony, his lawyer whispering instructions he couldn't hear. Inside, the courthouse smelled of antiseptic and was too brightly lit. Marble columns rose to the high ceiling, and the low hum of legal proceedings echoed down the long hallway. Olivia Carr was there, standing by the wooden bench outside the designated courtroom. Her briefcase was beside her, her arms folded, not in nervousness, but in determination. She saw him immediately. Malcolm paused for a moment, as if considering walking past, but eventually he moved closer. "You're here," she said, unsurprised. "You knew I would come." She nodded. "There's no turning back now. I didn't come to fight." "Good," she replied, "because the truth has landed." She turned and walked into the courtroom. He followed. There was no jury, no robed judge with his gavel ready to come down. This was not a criminal trial. It was merely a procedural hearing, a quiet step in a very noisy collapse. The judge reviewed the file, assessed the temporary asset freeze, and granted custody. Olivia spoke with her usual precision. Malcolm's lawyer, too, was careful and measured, not objecting, just cooperating. The judge nodded, made a note on the form, and set the next hearing date. It all took less than 20 minutes. As they stepped outside, the noise outside grew louder. The story exploded everywhere. The words "breaking news" flashed across every screen in a nearby coffee shop. The Crane Foundation is under investigation. Allegations of financial wrongdoing spread as the divorce became public. His face is everywhere, on television, social media, and soon in mocking memes. Once a brand, now a joke. But Malcolm didn't stay long. He got back in the car, closed the door, and sat still as the driver drove away. Elsewhere in town, Marianne Crane was folding baby jumpers. The nursery smelled of new linen and lavender, and her mobile twirled gently in the breeze from the open window. She doesn't watch the news. It's not necessary. The phone vibrated. Olivia's name appeared on the screen with a single message. "He's here. Everything is done." Marianne exhaled slowly and smiled. Not because he had fallen, but because she had finally stood up. Malcolm Crane's fingers swirled the amber liquid in his glass, premium, imported, aged whiskey. He liked the burn on his throat. It reminded him he was still in control. His Patek Philippe glinted in the sunlight streaming through the glass walls as he took another sip and leaned back in his chair. This is his life. Success, comfort, power. "Malcolm, have you checked the weather forecast?" Her voice was soft but demanding, like an engine in need of oil. He looked up and saw Elena standing by the window, one hand on her hip, the other scrolling through her phone. She was wearing a tight white silk dress that accentuated the figure that everyone at parties had been drawn to. Her long brown hair fell loosely to her shoulders, catching the brilliant sunset. He smiled lazily. "Why should I care about the weather, Elena? I have someone else to take care of that." She rolled her eyes mischievously, her crimson lips curling into a smile. "Because if there's a storm tomorrow, we'll have to cancel the cruise party, and that would be a disaster, right?" "Disaster for you," Malcolm laughed, setting his glass down on the marble coffee table. "For me, it's just another day." He didn't mean to be offensive, but there was a distance in his voice that Elena had grown all too familiar with over the past year. She didn't mind, though. She hadn't come here for the deep conversation. She had come for the luxury, the connections, and the thrill of walking alongside a man who could snap his fingers and change the world. As she approached, barefoot and light, her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen, a brief frown, then quickly hidden it. "Work email," she muttered. "Nothing important." Malcolm took her hand and pulled her down beside him. His eyes scanned her face. "You worry too much," he said, stroking her hair. "We're on vacation. Let someone else worry about it." She chuckled, leaning against him. "I like to be one step ahead. You taught me that, remember?" "Smart girl," he whispered. But his mind was already gone. His gaze darted away, past the infinity pool and out to sea, where waves crashed against the cliffs below. A moment of peace, and it was that peace that made him uneasy. He lives by action, by deals, by power plays, making sure his empire remains impregnable. This villa was supposed to be a place to rest, but the silence made him uneasy. His phone vibrated on the coffee table, and he reached for it reflexively, thinking it was a reminder from his assistant about next week's meeting. But the message that appeared made him pause. Late payment notice, investment-linked assets. Malcolm's brow furrowed as he opened the email. Margaret's estate was delinquent. The words seemed foreign, like they were someone else's problem. For him, financial hardship was something he'd lost in his personal vocabulary years ago. Belonged to his dictionary. And yet it had happened. What had she done to cause things to come to this? Something was wrong. Elena? Malcolm heard her voice, soft but questioning. He quickly locked the screen and forced a smile. Nothing important. But it was important, and this was not like Margaret. She was always careful, always paying attention to details he never had the patience to follow. Together, they had built the foundations of their empire. Her sharp financial mind, his vision, and shared ambition. But that had been years ago, before he felt he had outgrown her. Now, she was a shadow, managing a few redundant investments he had left for convenience. He sighed, pushing the thought aside. She would manage. She always did. Let's talk about something more interesting. He turned his attention back to Elena. Like what you're going to wear to the yacht party. If it doesn't rain. Her laughter rang out, light and carefree. And for a moment, he allowed himself to enjoy it. Not far away, Margaret Crane sat alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by unpaid bills and an empty cup of coffee. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room, the dark background echoing the weight pressing down on her chest. She ran her hand through her dark brown hair, streaked with gray. The gray seemed to have appeared overnight. Her eyes, once filled with ambition, were tired, reflecting the exhaustion of someone who had shouldered too many responsibilities alone. She picked up the letter from the bank, rereading the words she knew by heart. Final notice of delinquency. Her fingers tightened on the paper. Then she set it down gently, as if holding it for too long would burn her hand. Ironic. She was once the woman who could run multi-million-dollar budgets without breaking a sweat, the one who could spot financial risks before anyone else. But now that Malcolm is gone, the cracks are starting to show. The phone on the counter rang, and she reached for it reflexively. The name on the screen made her stop. James Donovan, an old friend, a mentor, a man who had believed in her abilities since before she had been a Crane. Her heart pounded as she picked up the phone. "James? Margaret," he said, his voice deep and steady. "I was thinking of you today. Just wanted to see how you were doing." She bit her lip, trying to keep her voice calm. "I'm fine. I heard about Malcolm's latest acquisition," he said carefully, as if gauging her reaction. Margaret clenched her fists. "I have nothing to do with it anymore." "I know," James replied, his voice softening. "But I also know that doesn't mean you should stop watching." She smiled slightly. "Old habit. Listen," he continued. "If you want to get back into the game, I have a project. It's small, but I think it's going to grow. I need someone like you." Margaret paused. For the first time in months, she felt something other than anxiety, a glimmer of hope, a possibility. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice steady. When she hung up the phone, the weight on her chest felt a little lighter. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't dread thinking about it. Outside, a light rain began to fall, pouring over the city like a promise of peace. Malcolm, still unaware of Margaret's quiet rise, checked his phone again. Another notification popped up, a payment reminder. This time, he didn't ignore it. But the consequences of neglecting it for so long were already starting to set in. Margaret Crane stood still, her eyes lingering on the picture from their honeymoon in Paris. Malcolm had his arm around her waist as they stood in front of the Eiffel Tower, their smiles filled with the joy of a time of shared ambition. She felt a tight knot in her chest at the memory, a reminder of how deeply she once believed in them. How long had that been? It seemed like another lifetime now. She looked away, refusing to fall into the trap of nostalgia. The woman Margaret, once so hopeful, had disappeared the day Malcolm had traded their companionship for power. She had spent years pretending that the marriage was still a partnership, quietly picking up the pieces while he drifted off into a world of multi-million-dollar deals and younger women. Every evening, she'd replay the moments she tried to hold on to him, the dinners, the smiles, the gentle compromises, only to find herself alone with bills and hollow vows. But now, the pieces were too scattered to put back together. The pile of bills on the kitchen counter was proof of that. She crossed the room, her slippers lightly scraping against the old wooden floor. Margaret sat down at the small wooden table where a cup of coffee had gone cold, unsinkable. The tabletop was littered with overdue notices, letters from creditors, and reminders that her name was still attached to the investments Malcolm had abandoned. Her fingers trembled as she sorted through the papers, each envelope adding a layer of pressure to her chest. A pang of shame mixed with resolve, shame for having let things slide, resolve to not let it define her. Her phone vibrated, breaking the silence. The screen flashed a reminder. Bank representative appointment, 10 a.m. Margaret sighed, running a hand through her shoulder-length brown hair. She hadn't meant to come. She paused at the door, summoning courage she hadn't felt in months. What was the point of meeting, when all she was going to do was reiterate what she already knew? Her time was up, and the bank was running out of patience. Another message came soon after. James Donovan. Don't cancel. We need to talk today. Trust me. She exhaled. James had always been a quitter, ever since they met in college. He had pushed her to apply for internships, take exams, and believe in herself. She had been unstoppable. She had plans, she had dreams, and she had no fear of failure. But the weight of failure had taught her more than success ever could. But life, Margaret had learned, had a way of wearing you down, especially when you're surrounded by people who once admired you and then rejected you. She put on her coat and walked out of the apartment. The bank was just as she remembered it. Cold, impersonal, with cold marble floors, the smell of freshly printed paper, and the screech of a ballpoint pen on a form. Margaret sat across from the bank representative, a man in his mid-30s, neatly dressed, trying to appear sympathetic but not genuine. His glasses glinted as he tapped his pen on the table, a vice that annoyed Margaret more than she cared to admit. "I'm afraid," he said, "we've come to a point where we have to make a final decision." "We've given you multiple extensions," he said, sliding a stack of documents toward her. "But without a payment plan or additional collateral, the property will be repossessed at the end of the quarter." Margaret Crane's heart sank, but her face remained impassive. She had learned long ago that showing weakness in moments like these only gave others more power over her. "I see," she said softly, her voice steady despite the storm inside. "Is there any chance of negotiation?" The man shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Crane. It's our policy not to." "No need to apologize," she interrupted, leaning forward slightly. "Just tell me the options." He hesitated before answering. "If you can secure a co-signer with significant assets or provide proof of future income, we can reconsider the terms. But as things stand now—" "Thanks," she interrupted again. "I'll see what I can do." The meeting ended with polite handshakes and forced smiles, but Margaret's mind was already racing toward other possibilities. As she stepped out into the cool morning air, she pulled out her phone and called James. "Margaret?" He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and steady. "How was the meeting?" "Just as I suspected," she replied, tightening her scarf around her neck. "They don't move." "Then we need to talk," James said firmly. "Can you come to Donovan and Company's office in an hour?" She hesitated. It had been years since she'd set foot in an office outside Malcolm's empire. But James wasn't offering pity. He was offering a lifeline, and this time she didn't want to refuse. "I'll be there," she said and hung up. The Donovan and Company offices were on the top floor of a glass building overlooking the city. Margaret's heels clicked on the marble floor as she approached the conference room, where James stood looking out the window. His silhouette stood out against the backdrop of skyscrapers. He turned when he heard her enter, his blue eyes sparkling warmly. "Margaret," he said, holding out his hand, "it's good to see you again." She smiled slightly, shook hands, and sat down. "Thanks for your time." "With you always," he replied, sitting across from her. "I've been following what's going on with Malcolm's company." Margaret stiffened slightly, but nodded. "I'm no longer involved." "I know," James said, "but I also know you still have instincts, and right now I need someone with vision like you." He slid a file across to her, its weight pressing down on her palm. Margaret opened it to find a detailed plan for a new project, microfinance for women entrepreneurs. Bold, ambitious, and exactly the kind of project that had once fascinated her. "I've had this in mind for a while," James explained, "but I needed someone to refine it, expand it, someone who understood both the financial and emotional side of these investments. Margaret's fingers brushed the edge of the file, absorbed in the information. "Why me?" she asked softly. "Because you're the best," James replied without hesitation, "and because I know you have something to prove, not to Malcolm, but to yourself." Her throat tightened, but she nodded. "I have nothing to lose." "No," James said, leaning toward her, "but you have everything to take back." The weight in Margaret's chest eased a little, replaced by something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. She closed the file, looking straight at James. "Do it." That evening, at her apartment, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, her mind buzzing with ideas. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, she was no longer afraid of the obstacles. She used to be overlooked, dismissed, undervalued, but not anymore. As he took a sip of tea, his phone vibrated again with a new message. "Malcolm Crane. Shall we talk real estate tomorrow?" She looked at the message for a few seconds, then hung up. She had her own priorities now. And Malcolm wasn't one of them. Margaret Crane opened her laptop, the screen's glow lighting up her modest living room. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, shaping the first draft of a business plan that, if successful, could rival the empire Malcolm had spent decades building. It was bold, ambitious, but above all, personal. Meanwhile, towering above the skyline, the reflective glass facade of Crane Holdings pierced the morning haze like a modern-day monument to ambition. From the outside, it screamed power, stability, dominance. Inside, the foundation was beginning to shift. Malcolm Crane strode into the executive lobby, each step echoing off the pristine marble floors. His navy suit was pressed to perfection, and the scent of his cologne lingered with the quiet command of a man used to being obeyed. But today, his shoulders were a fraction too tight. His gait, usually smooth and assured, carried a stiffness, born from stress he hadn't yet admitted aloud. "Good morning, Mr. Crane," the receptionist offered with a well-practiced smile. He nodded without slowing, barely acknowledging her, and entered the private elevator. The ride was silent. As the doors opened to the executive floor, he stepped into the curated symmetry of power. Floor-to-ceiling glass, black steel accents, and silence broken only by the distant hum of the city below. "Amelia?" he called out, stepping into his office. Amelia Carter, his executive assistant and more, sat at the conference table, already deep in her work. Her white blouse and flawless blonde hair reflected the luxury of the space, but her eyes stayed fixed on the screen. "Morning," she said, glancing up with a small smile. "I've prepped everything for the acquisition meeting. All projections are updated." "Good." Malcolm loosened his tie and dropped into a leather chair across from her. "Show me." She turned the screen toward him. Charts, forecasts, strategic plans. The deal was pivotal. Without it, Crane Holdings would plateau, and the board's confidence would begin to wobble. "The numbers support the buyout," Amelia said. "But there's chatter from a few investors. They're anxious about market volatility." Malcolm exhaled through his nose, tapping the armrest. "Let them worry. That's what they're paying us for. We don't flinch." Still, Amelia leaned forward. "It wouldn't hurt to present a contingency. Just something to ease nerves." He ran a hand through his thick dark hair. She wasn't wrong. Her instinct for risk was part of what made her more than just convenient. Still, this deal had cost months of careful maneuvering. Backing down wasn't an option. "I'll deal with the board," he said, closing the laptop. "We've come too far to flinch now." Just then his phone buzzed. A message from Greg Hastings, CFO. "Urgent. Need to discuss competitor interference before the meeting." Malcolm's jaw tensed. He called immediately. "Greg," he said. "What is it?" "We've got a problem." Greg replied, brisk. "3 major clients are holding off on renewals. A competitor's making a play." Malcolm sat up. "Which firm?" Greg hesitated. "A new player. Small but strategic. They've been quiet until now." "Who's behind it?" "We don't know yet," Greg admitted, "but I've got the team on it. I'll brief you before the meeting." Malcolm ended the call and stared out at the skyline. A small firm, targeting his key clients, bold, silent, and sudden. This wasn't just business. It was a challenge, and he didn't like surprises. It wasn't a coincidence. Someone was making moves, and they were doing it quietly enough to catch Malcolm Crane off guard. "What's going on?" Amelia asked, watching his expression tighten. "Potential competitor," Malcolm muttered. "They're trying to poach our clients." "Who?" she asked, already flipping open a second monitor. I don't know yet, but I need you and Greg to dig. Get me a full strategic profile. Amelia nodded and dove into the work. One of the usual players? No, Malcolm said, jaw tightening. Whoever this is, they're new, and they know exactly where to strike. He could feel the disruption, not just in numbers but in instinct. This wasn't random. It was surgical. Someone was targeting the weak spots only an insider would know. By noon, Malcolm stood in the conference room surrounded by his senior team. Spreadsheets and investor memos lined the long table. Greg Hastings stood at the head, flipping through slides on the screen. The firm's name is Horizon Dynamics, Greg explained. They operated quietly for the past year, focusing on mid-sized enterprises. But in the last 90 days, they've moved into direct competition. Our space. Malcolm's eyes scanned the graphs. The timing, the scale, the precision. This wasn't an ordinary market disruption. Someone was behind it. Someone with experience. Who's running it? Malcolm asked. Greg clicked again. Still confirming, but the CEO is listed as James Donovan. The name landed like a stone in Malcolm's stomach. James Donovan, a figure from his early rise, a mentor once to Margaret, an old ally turned unknown. But now, if James was backing Horizon Dynamics and Margaret was involved, it was no longer business. It was war. He felt a cold ripple crawl down his spine. James was not just a strategist, he was a tactician. And if Margaret had aligned with him, it meant she wasn't just retaliating, she was building. And that scared him more than he wanted to admit. Amelia noticed the flicker in Malcolm's eyes. Do you know him? Barely, Malcolm lied. But if he's working with Margaret, we've underestimated them. The room fell into a heavy silence. Greg cleared his throat. So what's the move? Malcolm interlaced his fingers, voice low. We don't blink. We push forward on the Parkside acquisition. That leverage can shut Horizon out before they scale. And Margaret? Amelia asked. Malcolm hesitated. The idea of facing her now, after everything, was uncomfortable in a way he hadn't anticipated. But he masked it quickly. I'll handle her, he said. She has no idea what she's walking into. But even as the words left his mouth, doubt stirred beneath the surface. Because part of him wondered, what if she did? What if she had always known exactly how to take him down? But as the meeting broke up and executives returned to their offices, the thought lingered like static behind his eyes. What if this had been years in the making? He shoved the idea aside. He wasn't about to lose. Not to Margaret. Not to anyone. Back in his office, Malcolm reviewed Horizon's investor reports. That's when the notification buzzed across his phone. Industry Forum. Special guest presentation. Margaret Crane, CEO, Horizon Dynamics. Margaret sat quietly in the back seat of the town car, fingers clasped around the leather folder in her lap. It contained the deck she'd be presenting. Numbers, vision, and the bold claim of a rising force in financial tech. Outside, the towers of the financial district glided past her window, steel and glass monoliths casting long shadows. But the city didn't intimidate her anymore. Not this version of her. As the car stopped in front of a minimalist glass office building, she smoothed the lapel of her navy blazer and adjusted a simple gold necklace, James's gift when she joined him at Horizon. It wasn't opulent, but it was hers. Like this moment. The driver opened the door. She stepped out, heels sharp against the pavement. The building's lobby greeted her with polished marble, fresh coffee, and the quiet buzz of ambition. Margaret moved with purpose. She had envisioned this walk countless times. Now it was real. The mirrored elevator doors opened, and her reflection stared back. Hair neatly parted, eyes steady, chin set with quiet confidence. The woman Malcolm once dismissed as a shadow in his empire was now here to challenge it. She had changed. The woman who once lived in Malcolm Crane's shadow was gone. In her place stood someone who had fought, inch by inch, to reclaim her identity, her voice, her worth. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the sleek conference room. Sunlight streamed in through floor-to-ceiling windows, washing the polished wood table in warm gold. James Donovan stood with a small group of investors. Their quiet conversation halted as Margaret entered. James offered a warm smile and extended his hand. Margaret, right on time. She took his hand firmly. The handshake wasn't just polite, it was an acknowledgement of everything they had built. I wouldn't miss it, she replied, voice steady. She scanned the room briefly. Helena Shaw, known for cutting through fluff in under 60 seconds. Marcus Bell, a risk-tolerant tech investor with a sixth sense for growth. Tom Kwan, whose analytic mind had earned him a reputation as the final word in valuation. They weren't just potential backers, they were the gatekeepers of the next level. James introduced the session, explaining the stakes and what Horizon Dynamics aimed to achieve. Margaret listened, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of her folder. This wasn't just a meeting. This was her chance to prove she belonged here, not beside someone, but on her own. James turned toward her with a nod. And now, I'd like to introduce Margaret Crane, our strategic lead. Her vision has been central to refining our direction and preparing us for the next phase of growth. Margaret rose. The room stilled. She walked to the front, placed her folder on the table, and clicked the presentation to life on the screen behind her. But she didn't speak immediately. She made eye contact with each person at the table. Intentional, unshaken. "I know what you're thinking," she began, tone firm but conversational. "Why trust a new firm with an untested model? Why take this risk?" Several investors shifted in their chairs, engaged now. The answer is simple. We're not just another startup chasing quarterly numbers. We're building something sustainable, targeted, impactful. We see a gap where others see noise. Women entrepreneurs, underserved by traditional banking, underestimated by established capital systems. She clicked to the first slide. A sharp growth curve of women-led businesses across the past decade. This isn't a niche, it's a missed opportunity, and we intend to close it. As she walked them through the deck, outlining inefficiencies in current lending pipelines, the lack of adaptable underwriting tools, the tech infrastructure Horizon was building, her voice remained calm, confident. She didn't just know the data, she believed in the mission. She shared stories of real women who had been denied funding, despite viable business plans and strong revenue streams. She painted a vision of what success could look like when the system dared to think differently. By the time Margaret reached the final slide, the room had fallen silent. She closed the presentation slowly and turned to face the group. "We're not just asking for your investment," she said. "We're inviting you to be part of a movement, one that redefines how financial inclusion looks and feels. Together, we can create something that doesn't just generate profit, but leaves a lasting impact." A moment passed, then another. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest, but she held her posture, composed and unwavering. Helena Shaw broke the silence first, reclining slightly in her chair, a manicured nail tapping rhythmically on the table. "Impressive," she said, her gaze sharp. "But how do you plan to compete with established players? They've got deeper pockets, wider reach." Margaret didn't flinch. "We're not competing with them head-on. We're targeting a segment they've ignored. Our size is our strength. We can move quickly, adapt solutions specifically, and with your backing we'll scale while staying agile." Marcus Bell nodded slowly. "What about contingencies? What if the market shifts or contracts suddenly?" Margaret smiled. She'd anticipated that. "We've layered our risk strategy, diversified portfolios, predictive models, and strategic alliances. If we need to pivot, we will. But we're not reacting to trends, we're forecasting them." Tom Kwan leaned forward, interest flickering behind his steely composure. "You've done your homework." "I have," she said simply. James saw the shift and stepped in. "Margaret's vision is not just well-prepared, it's forward-thinking. With your support, this won't just be a venture, it'll be a turning point." There was a pause, then Helena spoke again. "I'm in," she said, "but I want quarterly reports and a vote on major initiatives." Marcus and Tom followed shortly after, each with tailored terms. Margaret nodded, thanked them, and laid out the path forward. After the meeting, James pulled her aside. "You did it," he said quietly, his pride unmistakable. "We did," Margaret replied, but deep down she knew the victory was hers. As she stepped outside into the cool, late afternoon air, something shifted inside her. Not relief, something steadier. Purpose. Focus. She felt like herself again. A text pinged as she slid into the back of the waiting car. "Richard, see you at the industry event. Let's talk." She smiled, but not the smile of a woman shaken. This time Margaret Crane was ready. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the desk, a habit he hadn't indulged in since the early days of clawing Thornton Group into existence. Back then, pressure had been fuel. But this was different. The numbers on his screen were telling a story he hadn't prepared for. Quarterly earnings were down nearly 15%. Key clients were stalling on contract renewals. Investor confidence was slipping through his fingers like sand. Even the acquisition he'd been chasing with single-minded focus no longer looked like the savior he believed it to be. His empire, once a model of aggressive ambition and bulletproof strategy, was wobbling. And then there was Margaret. Her name, once a distant echo in boardrooms and tax filings, was suddenly everywhere. A headline, a disruptor, a threat. The phone buzzed against the desk, sharp and insistent. Greg Hastings, CFO. Richard picked up on the second ring. Greg? We've got a situation, Greg said without preamble. 3 more clients just pulled out. They're signing with Horizon Dynamics. Richard's grip on the phone tightened. 3 more? Yes, and it's not just them. I've had 2 board members reach out this morning. They're asking if you have a counter strategy. Richard stood, pacing to the window. The skyline, once a source of pride, now looked foreign, like a city that didn't recognize him anymore. We're not losing more clients, he said firmly. I'll handle it. Greg's voice on the other end was careful, measured. If we don't move now, this snowballs. Horizon Dynamics isn't just stealing clients, Richard. They're making us look obsolete. Margaret's not just working smart, she's working fast. The mention of her name struck something deep, but he wouldn't say it. Wouldn't give Greg or anyone the satisfaction of seeing him shaken. We're not obsolete, he snapped. They're capitalizing on a moment, that's all. Maybe, Greg replied. But perception's shifting, and if we don't do something soon, it's going to harden into reality. Richard ended the call without responding. He tossed the phone onto the couch and rubbed his temples, the pressure finally manifesting as a pounding throb behind his eyes. She wasn't going for the kill in a blaze of headlines. No, Margaret was dismantling his legacy client by client, quietly and methodically. There was a knock. Amelia stepped into the room, tablet in hand. Her face was carefully composed, but Richard caught the flicker of concern in her eyes. I thought you'd want to see this, she said, offering the screen. He took it. An industry article filled the screen. Horizon Dynamics, the rising star redefining financial services. Beneath the headline was a photo of Margaret, standing at a podium, composed and commanding. The light caught her jaw just right. The quiet confidence in her expression wasn't a statement, it was a warning. She's getting more attention, Amelia said, settling across from him. Investors are paying close attention now. Richard's silence said everything. He kept staring at the screen. He was used to winning. But this time, the battlefield had changed. This was her moment to take everything that had once been denied to her. Twilight cast the city in hues of amber and lavender as Richard Thornton leaned against the balcony railing of his penthouse. A glass of bourbon warmed in his hand. Below, the city buzzed. Car horns blared, streetlights flickered on, and the low murmur of conversations floated upward. But tonight, it all felt far away, like a movie playing in another room. He wasn't part of that world anymore. The wind stirred his dark hair as he took a slow sip, savoring the sting of the alcohol. He'd lost track of how many nights he'd spent out here lately, alone, restless, steeped in reflection. The empire he had built, once a symbol of control and prestige, was cracking. Every headline, every board meeting, every market dip led back to one name: Margaret. Horizon Dynamics wasn't just competition, it was taking over. And her face from the summit last week still haunted him, the calm power in her voice when she said, "I'm not interested in a truce. I'm interested in winning." She was winning, and deep down, that reality cut sharper than he expected. It wasn't just that she was ahead, it was that she had become everything he once claimed only he could be. His phone buzzed on the table behind him. He turned, placed his glass down, and picked it up. Amelia Carter. He paused for a second before answering. Amelia. Richard, she said, her voice smooth but urgent. I just came from the board meeting. His grip on the phone tightened. I wasn't told there was a meeting tonight. They didn't want you there, she replied. That's why I'm calling. They're losing confidence, Richard. They're talking contingency plans in case you can't get things under control. He shut his eyes. The words hit like a weight pressing into his chest. What kind of contingency plans? Replacing you as CEO, she said, her tone soft. Nothing's official yet, but the conversation is picking up speed. They're worried about investor fallout. They think new leadership might calm things down. Richard turned back toward the balcony, the night air sharp against his skin. Let me guess. Greg Hastings? He's one of them, Amelia admitted. But it's not just him. Outside advisors are stirring the pot. They think Horizon Dynamics is going to wipe us out if we don't act now. And what do you think? His voice had lowered. There was a pause. Then, I think you're still the only one who can fix this, but you're running out of time. Those last words echoed louder than the city below. He wasn't used to racing the clock, not like this. He ran a hand through his hair. Thanks for the warning. Don't thank me, she said. Just fix it. She hung up. Richard set the phone down on the railing. His thoughts spun. He couldn't lose control. Not now. Not with Margaret poised to deal the final blow. But what could he do? Every move felt like a misstep. Margaret wasn't just challenging him, she was beating him at his own game. It's not just about poaching clients anymore, it's about positioning. I see that, Richard muttered, setting the tablet down. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. She's built this company quietly, right under my nose. Amelia crossed her legs, tapping her fingers against the armrest. She had time. Years, actually. And now she's using everything she learned from you and turning it into her own strategy. The words stung more than Richard wanted to admit. He had always known Margaret was brilliant. Her financial skills had been a cornerstone of his early success. But he had assumed that brilliance had faded over time, buried beneath the weight of domestic life and their broken marriage. He had been wrong. Margaret's light hadn't dimmed, it had been redirected. What's the plan? Amelia asked, snapping him back to the moment. Richard stood buttoning his jacket. We go on the offensive. I want a list of our most vulnerable clients by the end of the day. We'll offer incentives to keep them. Discounted rates, custom packages, whatever it takes. And Margaret? Amelia asked, raising an eyebrow. I'll deal with her personally, Richard said, his voice cold and final. She wants to play in my world? Fine. But she doesn't know what it's like to be the focus of my full attention. The following week, Margaret attended a prestigious financial summit where Horizon Dynamics was featured as one of the fastest-growing firms in the sector. The venue, a luxury hotel with massive chandeliers casting golden hues across the grand ballroom, buzzed with energy. Executives and investors mingled over drinks, the air filled with conversation, laughter, and the soft clinking of crystal glasses. Margaret positioned herself along the periphery, taking in the scene. She had always preferred to assess the room from the edges, reading people and dynamics before stepping into the spotlight. But tonight, she wasn't a spectator. She was part of the elite. Big crowd, James said, joining her with a glass of wine. Very, Margaret replied, eyes scanning. It's the perfect setting to reinforce our credibility. Her gaze caught on Richard, who had just walked in. Impeccably dressed as always, but his posture carried a strain of an edge that hadn't been there before. Their eyes locked across the room. For a moment, neither moved. He's heading this way, James observed quietly before stepping aside. Margaret inhaled deeply, holding her composure as Richard approached. His smile was careful, his tone even. Margaret, he greeted. We keep finding ourselves in the same places. Funny how that works, she said coolly. Enjoying the summit? Could be better. Think we could talk? He asked, gesturing toward a quieter corner. She paused, but eventually nodded. As they walked, the buzz of the ballroom faded, replaced by the soft sound of their footsteps on marble. They stopped near the balcony, where the cool night air rolled in. Richard sat opposite her, his tone measured. You've been busy. So have you, Margaret replied, her body relaxed, yet alert. But I assume this isn't small talk. He gave a soft laugh, brushing his hand through his hair. No, I came to say congratulations. Horizon Dynamics is making waves. That Langston deal was smart. Thanks, but you didn't track me down just for flattery, did you? No, he admitted. We're on a collision course, and we both know it. She didn't blink. So? I'm proposing a truce, he said, voice quieter now. There's room in this market for both of us. We don't have to tear each other apart. Margaret held his gaze, thoughtful. The history between them was heavy, layered. But she wasn't here to split the win. You still don't get it, she said calmly. I'm not looking for a ceasefire. I'm aiming to win. Richard's breath hitched. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. For once, the message was perfectly clear. This wasn't about coexistence. This was about rising on her terms. This was her moment to take everything that had once been denied to her. Twilight cast the city in hues of amber and lavender as Richard Thornton leaned against the balcony railing of his penthouse, a glass of bourbon warmed in his hand. Below, the city buzzed. Car horns blared, streetlights flickered on, and the low murmur of conversations floated upward. But tonight, it all felt far away, like a movie playing in another room. He wasn't part of that world anymore. The wind stirred his dark hair as he took a slow sip, savoring the sting of the alcohol. He'd lost track of how many nights he'd spent out here lately, alone, restless, steeped in reflection. The empire he had built, once a symbol of control and prestige, was cracking. Every headline, every board meeting, every market dip led back to one name: Margaret. Horizon Dynamics wasn't just competition, it was taking over. And her face from the summit last week still haunted him. The calm power in her voice when she said, "I'm not interested in a truce, I'm interested in winning." She was winning. And deep down, that reality cut sharper than he expected. It wasn't just that she was ahead, it was that she had become everything he once claimed only he could be. His phone buzzed on the table behind him. He turned, placed his glass down, and picked it up. Amelia Carter. He paused for a second before answering. "Amelia." "Richard," she said, her voice smooth but urgent. "I just came from the board meeting." His grip on the phone tightened. "I wasn't told there was a meeting tonight." "They didn't want you there," she replied. "That's why I'm calling. They're losing confidence, Richard. They're talking contingency plans in case you can't get things under control." He shut his eyes. The words hit like a weight pressing into his chest. "What kind of contingency plans?" "Replacing you as CEO," she said, her tone soft. "Nothing's official yet, but the conversation is picking up speed. They're worried about investor fallout. They think new leadership might calm things down." Richard turned back toward the balcony, the night air sharp against his skin. "Let me guess, Greg Hastings?" "He's one of them," Amelia admitted. "But it's not just him. Outside advisors are stirring the pot. They think Horizon Dynamics is going to wipe us out if we don't act now." "And what do you think?" His voice had lowered. There was a pause. Then, "I think you're still the only one who can fix this, but you're running out of time." Those last words echoed louder than the city below. He wasn't used to racing the clock, not like this. He ran a hand through his hair. "Thanks for the warning." "Don't thank me," she said. "Just fix it." She hung up. Richard set the phone down on the railing. His thoughts spun. He couldn't lose control. Not now. Not with Margaret poised to deal the final blow. But what could he do? Every move felt like a misstep. Margaret wasn't just challenging him. She was beating him at his own game. The irony didn't escape him. He had once dismissed her as someone who lacked vision, someone destined to follow, not lead. And now, Margaret was the very reason his vision was falling apart. The next morning, Richard arrived at Thornton Group earlier than usual. The building was still cloaked in quiet as the city began to stir. He settled into his office, sunlight pouring through the tall windows and casting sharp lines across the disarray of documents on his desk. Financial reports, client retention strategies, competitive analysis, all of it told the same bleak story. Decline. But one report stood out. It detailed Horizon Dynamics' latest acquisitions, including a small but strategically vital financial advisory firm that had long been a key partner of Thornton Group. Margaret had absorbed them into her expanding network, severing one of his company's most valuable ties. He stared at the page, heart thudding. She wasn't just building her own empire, she was methodically dismantling his. And she was doing it with the precision of someone who had once known every blueprint, every weak point. His fingers tightened around the edge of the report. The familiarity of her moves, the way she chose her targets, the timing, it was surgical, it was personal. A knock at the door pulled him out of the spiral. "Come in," he called. Greg Hastings entered, his expression controlled but tense. His usual polished appearance was intact, but there was something clipped about his movements, less confidence, more caution. "Got a minute?" Richard gestured toward the chair across from him. "Let me guess, you're here about the board." Greg sat down, folding his hands. "They're nervous. Investors are spooked. We've lost 6 major clients in the last month, and Horizon Dynamics is gaining ground fast. They're out if we don't pivot." "I know," Richard cut in, leaning forward. "But replacing me won't fix this. The damage is already done, and sticking someone else in this chair isn't going to stop Margaret from advancing. Greg nodded slowly. Then what's the play? Richard paused. For the first time in his professional life, he didn't have a firm answer. But he couldn't show that. Not to Greg, not to the board, and definitely not to himself. I'm meeting with Margaret today, he said at last. I need to find out what she wants. Greg's eyebrows lifted. You think she'll back off? No, Richard admitted, but if we're going to survive this, I have to understand her endgame. He didn't say the rest aloud, that he needed to see her. Face to face. To confirm if the woman now leading his downfall was still in any way the one he once believed in. Greg stood, straightening his tie. Just don't take too long. The board won't wait. When the door clicked shut behind him, Richard leaned back and stared at the ceiling. He had underestimated Margaret for too long. She wasn't the woman who had once quietly supported him from the sidelines. She was a force now, with her own vision, her own goals, and none of them included him. The restaurant was upscale, discreet, the kind of place where multi-million-dollar deals were made behind soft lighting and soundproof booths. Richard arrived early, requesting a private corner near the back. He ordered a scotch and took slow, deliberate sips as he watched the entrance. When Margaret stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. She wore a deep emerald green dress that highlighted her quiet authority. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she moved with unhurried poise. Her expression was unreadable. "Richard," she said, sliding smoothly into the seat across from him. "I wasn't sure you'd show," Richard said. "I could say the same about you," Margaret replied, her tone cool as she accepted the glass of wine the waiter set before her. But she didn't drink it. "So what's this about?" she asked, eyes steady. He studied her for a moment, taking in the poise, the control, the calm defiance in her presence. This wasn't the same woman he once knew. "I want to know what you're really after," he said at last. "Is this revenge?" Margaret tilted her head, considering the question. "If it were, you'd already be out of business." "Then what is it?" he pressed. She leaned in, voice low but resolute. "This is about building something that's mine, something that can't be taken, ignored, or erased. I spent years helping you build your dream, Richard. Now I'm building mine." He swallowed hard, the words hitting deeper than he expected. "And there's no room for compromise?" he asked. "There was," she replied, "but that ended the day you chose someone else over me." Richard leaned back, her words settling in his chest like stone. All these years he believed power meant never backing down. But now, sitting across from Margaret, he saw a different kind of power, walking away and thriving. Margaret stood, smoothing her dress. "I'll see you at the next board meeting," she said evenly, then turned and walked away. He remained seated, the click of her heels fading into the distance. For the first time he felt the full sting, not just of defeat, but of losing the woman he once took for granted. His phone buzzed. A message from Greg. "We need to talk. It's urgent." But Richard already knew. Margaret's victory wasn't on the horizon. It was here. The boardroom at Thornton Group was unusually quiet. Morning sunlight filtered through glass walls, casting long shadows on the polished oak table where Richard sat, flanked by board members. He wasn't reading the reports in front of him. His gaze was fixed on the skyline, searching for a way out that didn't exist. The silence was broken by Greg Hastings. "We're running out of options," he said, sliding a folder toward Richard. "Investors are nervous. Horizon Dynamics is devouring our market share. We have to move." Richard didn't need to open the folder. He already knew what it was. A merger proposal, with terms that heavily favored Horizon Dynamics. That meant Margaret. "This isn't just about surviving," Greg continued. "It's about aligning with the future. Margaret's vision. It's where the market is headed. Like it or not, we need her." Richard's jaw clenched. The woman he'd dismissed, sidelined, underestimated, was now the key to saving his legacy, and it wasn't just business anymore, it was personal. Then the door opened. Margaret entered the room like a wave of resolve. Confident, controlled, commanding. She wore a crisp white blouse and navy blazer. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek bun, her presence impossible to ignore. "Thank you for coming on short notice," Greg said, standing to greet her. Margaret took Richard's usual seat at the head of the table. No one objected. She opened her own folder. "I've reviewed the merger proposal," she began. And while I agree consolidation is the logical next step, I have a few terms I'd like to clarify. Richard leaned forward, tension tightening in his shoulders. Already making demands? I'm negotiating, Margaret replied without hesitation. That's what we do, isn't it? She outlined her conditions with surgical precision. Resource sharing, client integration, future scalability. But one clause stood out above the rest. I would take over as CEO, she said, eyes steady. Richard will remain as an advisor. That part is non-negotiable. The market needs to see decisive leadership. We won't stabilize anything by clinging to the past. Richard's pulse quickened. Each heartbeat was a reminder of what he was losing. And if I don't agree? Richard asked. Margaret tilted her head, a flicker of sadness passing through her eyes. Then the board will vote to replace you, and the merger will proceed without your input. I'm offering you a chance to shape how it happens. Her voice wasn't cruel, just certain. She wasn't here to humiliate him. She was here to complete what she had started. The silence in the room thickened as her words settled in. Richard's mind raced. Memories flickered. Late nights building the company, shared ambition, whispered plans for the future. But all of it was clouded now by resentment and betrayal. He had cast her aside. Now she was returning the favor. I need a minute, he said, standing quickly and walking out before anyone could speak. He found himself on the rooftop terrace. The wind was cold, biting against his face as he looked out at the sprawling city below. He hadn't come here to think. Thinking wouldn't change anything. He had come to breathe. The sharp sting of air filled his lungs, clearing the fog of pride and panic. His hands gripped the railing, knuckles white, as he tried to anchor himself to something solid, anything. He heard the soft echo of footsteps behind him, but didn't turn. He knew it was Margaret. She stopped a few steps away, her hair moving slightly in the breeze. You didn't have to follow me, he said, voice low. I wanted to, she replied, her tone gentler. This isn't easy for me either. He gave a bitter laugh, shaking his head. It's easier for you. You're winning. It's not about winning, Richard, she said, stepping closer. Her gaze remained on the horizon. It's about building something that matters. I spent so long helping you build your dream. When you left me behind, I forgot who I was. But I found myself again. And now I'm building something that's mine. She paused, then added softly, something I can be proud of when I look in the mirror. He turned to her, the pain in his eyes visible. I never meant for it to end this way. I know, she whispered, but it did. They stood in silence. Below them the city moved forward. Cars, people, life, as if untouched by the collapse between them. I'll agree to your terms, Richard said finally, the words bitter on his lips. Not because I want to, but because I have to. Margaret nodded. It's the right decision. Maybe, he said, but it doesn't feel like it. She reached out, rested her hand gently on his arm. You'll figure it out, Richard. Just like I did. Then she turned and walked away, leaving him alone on the rooftop. He watched her silhouette disappear through the door, and for a moment his chest ached, not from loss, but from the sudden, jarring clarity that this was no longer his story to command. He stood there, the wind pressing against his suit, the skyline no longer a symbol of power, but of acceptance. The next week, the merger became official. News outlets across the country ran the same headline: Horizon Dynamics acquires Thornton Group in landmark deal. Margaret's image appeared on every screen, every article. Her name now stood for success. Richard watched the coverage from his office, now stripped bare. The awards, the photographs, the symbols of his legacy, all packed away in boxes. He still held the advisory title, but he knew it was temporary. Soon he would be just another name in a chapter that had already closed. And maybe that was okay. But as he walked through the lobby one last time, sunlight spilled across his face. And for the first time in weeks, he exhaled. Margaret had won. But maybe, just maybe, that wasn't the end of his story. In a distant high-rise, Margaret sat at her new desk, the city stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The same skyline Richard once admired. But she wasn't thinking of him. She was thinking of what came next, a future built by her own hands, on her terms. And this was just the beginning. So, that's it. The story has come full circle, and you, our wonderful friend, you're still here, aren't you? If you're watching or listening this far, then something must have touched your heart in a quiet, meaningful way. Maybe it wasn't just about business empires, betrayals, or boardroom battles. Maybe it was about something deeper. Rediscovering yourself after being forgotten, learning to breathe again after silence, and choosing to walk away, not out of weakness, but out of strength. Margaret's journey reminds us that healing is not about revenge. It's about release. It's about realizing, as Marcus Aurelius once wrote, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. And maybe, just maybe, that's the lesson we carry forward. That the quietest decisions, like letting go, choosing peace, or building something from scratch, can be the most powerful. Richard's Fall 2 tells us something, that no title, no suit, no glass office can shield us from our choices. And as Epictetus said, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Pain can either shape us or break us, but it's what we do after the fall that defines our legacy. So now, dear listener, if something in this story stirred you, held up a mirror, or whispered truth to you, don't just keep it inside. Hit like. Share this with someone who needs a quiet nudge. And subscribe to stay with us. Because stories like this aren't just fiction. They're reflections of us, of you. And remember, you are not what you've lost. You are what you choose next. Until next time.